Hello, everyone. So I'm Francesca Cazzulino. I am new to Pacific Heart, and this is my first Women's Health Symposium. Luckily, this isn't my first conference ever I've been to, so I understand that I stand between you and lunch, and I will try to make this brief. So you guys have already heard a lot about this, how all these environmental factors, pollutants, plastics, et cetera, interact with your cardiovascular health. I'm not going to belabor the point. And I think stepping back, I want to think about how your exposure really is dictated by where you are physically, who you are. And this has been a theme as well, but who you interact with, where you live, what your culture is, where you work, where you travel, is going to dictate what you put in your body, what you bring into your home, what you are exposed to. And so that's true whether you live in Santa Monica, South Central LA, Beijing, Dubai, anywhere in the world is going to dictate how you interact with these various exposures. So this is a map looking at sort of how excess mortality is affected by the PM 2.5 particles that we've heard so much about. And as you can see, while we're all exposed to varying levels of this, there's excess mortality in certain areas of the world. And a lot of that is dictated by, yes, the exposure that they have, but densely populated areas are more likely to be exposed and more affected. So looking at this map particularly, you see India, China, sort of Southeast Asia and Africa are more affected by these than, say, if you look over in America, where we're sort of white and we have less white on the map, and we have less excess mortality. And this is a map sort of giving you a reference point of how much exposure we have globally based on where you live. But focusing a little more on the United States, this, I think you guys will be sort of drawn to California, where we have some of the most particle concentration exposure. And this is all sort of in the Central Valley, the San Joaquin Valley, where we have a high amount of agriculture and oil production and house and industry there. And they actually, for the past 25 years, have been out of compliance with the EPA. And it's given the sort of unpopular term of sort of the worst environmental impact in the world, or at least in the country. So just something that I was not aware of. So, but that beyond the particle matter, we really need to think about your environmental burden is dictated by all the things we've talked about today. So your air pollution, but also how close you are to hazardous waste sites or toxic chemicals or factories, your built environment. So your green spaces, your traffic environment, your infrastructure, sort of how close you are to roadways and airports, and then water pollution. All these things can be put together into a sort of environmental burden index, and that's very specific based on where you live in the country. So this is a map that sort of shows you that. It shows you across in various communities, the various environmental burden, putting all these things together. And we can see that it's sort of targeted a lot in the Midwest, has a lot, which there's a lot of agriculture and industry there. And then also California has some of that as well. And it's also very urban areas. And so you can see this distribution. When we look in the study, when they looked at how that environmental burden interacts with cardiovascular health, something we've talked about already, but these areas where there's a higher environmental burden also have higher prevalence of cardiovascular disease, so hypertension, diabetes, obesity, coronary artery disease, and stroke risk. But interestingly, there's also in these areas, or maybe not so interestingly, not surprisingly, I guess, there's higher risks of poverty, people who are uninsured, racial and ethnic minorities are more concentrated in areas that have a higher environmental burden risk. And so this is a heat map looking at that poverty burden in our country and how that's distributed. And if you look at this next map, you might notice that there's which looks at sort of the adult coronary artery disease distribution. You might notice a sort of similar color pattern. Oh, how do I go back? There we go. Where yes, where you live is very important, and it interacts very closely with your socioeconomic status and how that impacts your cardiovascular health, which is a complicated interaction. So Dr. Ranjagopalan already talked about this social vulnerability index. This is not only your sort of socioeconomic status, but your racial and ethnic minority status, your household characteristics, how well you speak English in your house, your disability, and then your housing status, sort of where you live, quarters, apartment, a mobile home, and how that all these things can sort of be put together into an aggregate score to determine how vulnerable you are. And when we look at sort of your environmental burden, and then how that, and when you stratify your environmental burden and the association with cardiovascular disease, when we stratify based on your social vulnerability index, you can see the association between your environmental burden and your cardiovascular disease is a stronger association when you're more vulnerable. So that's these sort of top lines in each of these categories. You can see that there's a stronger association. And so this sort of highlights that while environmental burden impacts all of us, there's a great disparity based on your social vulnerability across our country. And when we look specifically, not only are those who are socially vulnerable and having higher environmental burden, there's an association there. It's also found that in areas where there's a when people are more socially vulnerable, they're in areas of higher mental burden, and there's a distinction within those areas. So if you're in an area where there's a higher, where you're more socially vulnerable, you're more likely to be in an area where there's higher air pollution, and then there's higher proximity to toxic waste plants or factories. And this is from sort of many factors, as I'm sure we're aware, sort of systemic redlining and systemic racism that has put, and zoning that has put certain populations in areas that are allowed to live closer to sort of these facilities, where if we look at populations that are less socially vulnerable, their sort of environmental burden is is more associated with their built environment. So I think that this is sort of well established in this risk calculator. So this is something as cardiologists that we use to determine your sort of cardiovascular risk. It's looking at various traditional risk factors. As you can see, blood pressure, diabetes, hypertension, cholesterol. But interestingly, we also include your zip code, which is something we've already talked about is very important when determining your risk. So I wanted to focus more, sorry, I have so many maps. I wanted to focus more on Los Angeles, something that we all associate. What is sort of our environmental burden in Los Angeles, and how does that interplay? And so I think we're all pretty familiar that in LA we have bad traffic, and that impacts our pollution. And if you look closer, this sort of highlights LA County in the lower corner there, and you can see that our particle matter pollution is higher in this area as well. So I think when we look at the environmental burden of Los Angeles, think of air pollution, extreme temperatures, which is not something we've talked about as much today, and then our risk of wildfires. So it's not news to anyone that hopefully not news to anyone that our planet is heating up, and this is sort of the projected increased heat in LA County specifically. You can see there's a variability based in where you live, but everywhere is expected to heat up by mid-century. And why is this important to cardiovascular health? So there's an interplay here where, high heats result in dehydration. Dehydration results in low blood volume, which results in decreased perfusion and damage to your various organs. If you're dehydrated and your blood pressure is low, then your heart can pump less blood out, and that results in your heart compensating by increasing its heart rate, increasing its contractility, which puts more strain on your heart. So overall, this sort of interplay is important to your cardiovascular health. This was a study done in a very densely populated province in China, where they looked at the interaction between extreme heat and particle exposure and how it impacts specifically myocardial infarction. So this is a case crossover study where each person is their own case and control, and they looked over and sort of compare over time, and they picked out people who passed away from myocardial infarctions. And in this population, in this study, they found that there was a significant interaction between the high heat events and that exposure to particle matter, and how those two things resulted in increased mortality for myocardial infarction. Interestingly, women, bringing in the heart health for women, were more vulnerable to these heat waves. And so this has been talked about already, but it's not surprising from what we've already learned about how particle matter increases your thrombogenicity, your atherosclerosis burden, and your inflammatory response, that if you're also dehydrated and in a high heat environment, that these two things can interact to increase your cardiovascular health. Looking specifically at LA, so this is a map that looks at excess emergency room visits over the course of a sort of heat wave as a sort of marker for how heat impacted health in the area. And you can see there was a large discrepancy within the LA County area, where areas that are traditionally more disadvantaged experienced higher levels of emergency room visits during this period of time, and really highlights the difference in your exposure to green space, your predisposing factors, and your maybe in your socioeconomic status. So finally, I wanted to touch a little bit on wildfires, as I think that that is globally an issue, but I think is something that a lot of us have been affected by in the Los Angeles area, and is unfortunately something that I think we all need to recognize is going to be something that we will continue to be affected by. This is a map that sort of projects the expected amount of wildfire burden that we're going to have by the mid-century. Most of it, as you can see, is sort of concentrated in the San Gabriel Mountains. There's expected to be, which is sort of a significant area, high-risk area, and it's expected to be a higher amount of wildfires in that area. And why is this important? So there's data that basically suggests that in sort of an acute wildfire setting, I've already talked to you some about this, there's higher risk of heart attack, stroke, arrhythmia or rhythm issues, high blood pressure that can cause an actual crisis or damage to your organs, or heart failure exacerbations. And then on a more long-term scale, which has already been talked about, there's higher risk of blood pressure or elevated blood pressure and atherosclerotic disease. Smoke from these wildfires can travel huge distances. So it's not just about living near a fire and sort of being exposed directly. It has a smoke in one area travels up to 300 miles. And so most people in California definitely over the past year were exposed to fires, and you can see all over the country, all over the world. But these impacts do affect people differently. If you think about those who are, for either their work requirement, et cetera, are required to work outside for economic reasons or social reasons, our sort of first responders are obviously the ones who were in the line. I think there was a lot of publicity about the lack of facial masks and protection that a lot of those workers had during the Palisades and Eaton fires. And so they have high exposure risk compared to people who are working in office buildings or who have the ability to leave the area if there is a wildfire. Furthermore, people who have pre-existing health conditions, which has already sort of been talked about, are at higher risk of having some sort of having worsening health effects from wildfire smoke. As sort of Dr. Ranjagopal's initial slide looking at the two cases, sort of your environment, your exposure, the one woman who lived in a low-income area, who didn't have air filtration, who had to keep her windows open, who maybe lived in a less secure home. Those people are at higher risk when there's a wildfire exposure. And in those areas, usually older buildings that are not well maintained, landlords are less likely to make those improvements for those people. And those people probably don't have the resources to sort of mitigate those things by buying air filters or traveling to sort of get away from the fire exposure. So I want to pause because I know that most people in this room were affected by the fires last year. And I don't want to, and I know it's probably not easy to hear there's going to be more fires, they're going to be more severe, that this is going to be an ongoing issue. And I don't want to say, and I understand that there's a whole devastation that comes with the personal experience of going through that. And it's totally different from the environmental burden that we all experience. But I think we do need to acknowledge that this is real, this is going to continue to happen, and we need to figure out, I think the whole purpose of this conference is to talk about how we can work within the environment and the exposures that we have. Finally, I wanted to end on a slightly more positive note, which has already been touched about, but the importance of green space, which I think in LA and California, we have amazing green spaces to take advantage of. And you really got to think about this. There's sort of the larger green spaces, going camping, going to the mountains, getting out of our urban environment. Then there's the urban environment green spaces, parks that we have, going to the beach, we're so lucky that we can drive a few miles to get into the mountains and go for amazing hikes. And then personal green spaces. So your garden, your house plants, everything like that has some impact and improves things for you. There's tons of data that suggests that sort of how dense your population is, the traffic safety, your recreational activities are tightly linked to your physical activity levels, your BMI. Places that have higher density traffic are less walkable, have more incident coronary artery disease, and areas that are more walkable are associated with decreased levels of type 2 diabetes, and overall increased vegetation is protective for your cardiovascular health. So there's, and again, as has already been commented on, there are a lot of confounding factors here. Places that are greener are likely more wealthy, and some of the studies I looked at did sort of show that some of these effects are slightly attenuated when stratifying for that. But generally, living closer to a green space is associated with lower all-cause mortality and cardiovascular mortality. And this sort of highlights that in more detail. So I thought this was sort of interesting that looking at people who had heart attacks, there was they basically had less injury from their heart attack if they lived in a more green area. And then actually the degree of narrowing was lower. That sort of suggests that maybe being in a green space lowers your or exposure to green space basically lowers your subclinical coronary atherosclerosis. And why is this? I mean, I think some of it you guys can sort of already assume. The social effects, the going out with people, walking, the physical activity, the stress burden that releases, having a safe environment to do those activities is important. But plants filter air pollution. They produce oxygen. They block noise. They block noise and light, which are things that we didn't talk as much about. And then we know that there are these human effects that we have from this. It lowers your blood pressure, it lowers your BMI, it increases your improves your cardiovascular health, and through various multiple mechanisms. And so I think if I could leave you with one sort of positive thing before we all go eat, I think that we can't control everything. A lot of the things that we need to do to change this are higher policy level changes that need to be made. And I mean, we can advocate and we should do everything we can personally and for our community. There are ways that you can go out and plant trees in areas in the LA area that have less access to green spaces. But I think that, as has already been talked about, engaging in your environment, getting out there, not being afraid of the air pollution but going and enjoying your green spaces, being active is one of the best things you can do for your cardiovascular health. there's data to support it. So thank you so much.